Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Andrea Piero, Director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Each year, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of public presentations by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars with the mission to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art and culture. Throughout its history, the program has served as a critical resource and inspiration for our community. And tonight, we are honored to welcome visiting artist Huma Bhabha to SAIC. Huma and I have been working on this visit for a couple years now, so we are really grateful that the weather cooperated so she could travel to Chicago. And I would like to thank Huma for taking the time to be here this evening to share her work with all of us and for her generosity meeting with students today. Tonight's program is partially supported by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and I would like to thank them for their support of tonight's program. At the end of the presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes to take 4 or 5 questions from the audience before the program concludes at 7:30. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff will circulate microphones for your use. We do ask that if you are posing a question to please stand, say your name, and to keep your question concise. And as with any event, please maintain respect for your fellow audience members as well as our guest. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Sampada Aranki, Assistant Professor in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism, to welcome Huma Bhabha. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you, Andrea. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Huma Bhabha for this evening. I'll never forget the first time I saw one of her sculptures. I was slack-jawed in awe, trying to make sense of the contours of her objects. They are bodies that stick with you. For hours after, I imagined these uncanny bodies' secret lives, how they would move if they could, where they would go, how they would rest, how they would commune. I couldn't stop wondering about how they felt. Huma's sculptures look like they feel heavy, with the center of gravity that gives a sense of weightedness. When we look closely, we realize these works are largely composed of the lightest of contemporary materials, Styrofoam. This packaging material is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, composing the texture of our everyday lives. Huma uses this material and transforms its everyday uptake into grotesque objects of curiosity and concern. She asks us to take a second and third and fourth look at Styrofoam. In her hands, this material's weight is not in its actual heaviness or lightness, but rather weight itself becomes a general feeling, a sensibility to reflect upon. This feeling of heaviness folds back on itself when we think about our general relation to this material and its impact on our bodies, our environments, our atmospherics. Huma's use of Styrofoam invites a consideration about the afterlife of this oft-discarded material. Scientists predict that Styrofoam will take 500 to 1 million years to biodegrade. Even then, they say, there's no guarantee. I imagine Huma's sculptures as artifacts from the future coming back to visit us, reminding us of what will happen to the waste and detritus that we make today. It's as if these objects are fortune tellers, laying bare the underbelly of our present. These are contemporary relics that force us to face the future we are currently making. In this material world, Bhabha invites us to reimagine how we value, what we prioritize, and how the decisions we make are also making decisions for a future we may not be in. Huma's material world is one where we can anticipate and perhaps shift futures unknown. Her adept attention to the meaning of materiality and the materiality of meaning can be experienced across her sculptures and photo-based drawings. Feeling, weight, and waste are continuous themes, asking us to forge methods for thinking and being that can hold tension and slack, heaviness and lightedness, organic and inorganic, disturbance and delight. Huma's work has been the subject of numerous exhibitions, including MoMA PS1, Aspen Art Museum, the 56th Venice Biennale, International Center of Photography Triennial, the Triennial at the Palais de Tokyo, the 2010 Whitney Biennial, 7th Guangzhou Biennial, and the Royal Academy of Arts. She was the 2013 recipient of the Berlin Prize, the Una S. Mannheim Fellowship in the Visual Arts, American Academy in Berlin, and received the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum's Emerging Artist Award in 2008. She is represented in many major museum collections, such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts, the Centre Georges Pompidou, the Fondation Louis Vuitton, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales, among others. Finally, it has just been announced that Huma has been commissioned to create a site-specific installation for the Met's Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Roof Garden. The Roof Garden Commission, Huma Bhabha, We Come in Peace, will be on view from April 17th to October 28th, 2018. Please join me in welcoming Huma Bhabha.
Thank you for having me. It's a big honor for me, and I will start by reading a poem by Shelley called Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. My Karachi and New York are 2 places where I have spent my life, and the influence, the physical influence of these places have had an influence on my work that has slowly emerged, and I myself, it took me a while to realize what I was making and where the influence was coming from. The connection that I have to a special kind of physical rawness found in Karachi, where I was born and raised, and the monumental scale of the concrete canyons of New York are 2 important influences that sort of decided to have come together in the work. Approaching events indirectly by way of specific moments in the history of sculpture and responding to the physical connections of a certain kind of rural and urban landscape. The stories and themes that I'm interested in, for example, war, colonialism, displacement, memories of home, and the contemporary ruins of war, but without losing sight of the comedic theatrical elements and inherent humor that rescues from despair and probes events surgically within the shadow of popular culture, make up the sculptural landscape that I operate within. When I set out to make my work, there is not a specific set plan, and the work starts to develop between a balance of practicality and form. I will today be showing a variety of images from the ancient up to the contemporary, which either directly or indirectly inform my work, along with images of my own work. The first image on the screen is Untitled, and it's from 2007, a Seep print and it's from a series of 4 prints that I made in 2007 of the same sculpture, but in different same setting, or different settings, but the same 2 feet. These photos, I decided on a trip to Mexico where I first experimented with clay. I decided to make the sculpture, and I was using real clay, so I didn't have much time to actually document it, and I knew that it was not going to survive because I was not going to fire the clay. So I decided to take a photograph of it in the tradition of other artists who have done the same thing. So this is one of those. The next maybe 1 or 2 images that I'm going to show you are from undeveloped areas and active construction sites. And some of these structures are where construction workers live. And to me, it looks like shelter as sculpture. They actually depict more the idea of the urban ruin and are, for me, raw materials for my sculpture. This is an interesting, it's a debris chute and also an interesting conveyor belt. This is a drawing from 2007, Untitled, on a black and white photograph, and with colored ink. A painting by Julie Moretu titled Conjured Parts, I, from 2016. It's a combination of landscape and urbanism. Another found urban site, which for me, it relates to arte povera. Sculpture, more than any other art form, is about time and history, using materials which can last for centuries, and now in recent history we see more and more the use of fragile temporary materials which seem to reflect the speeding up of decay, causing instant ruins. And this image on the screen is Robert Smithson's Monuments of Passaic. There is also a historical connection to romanticized ruins. Like him, I see beauty in these forsaken landscapes, and their scale and rawness seeps into my work. These next few images are of one of the largest sculptures I've done up to date, and it fuses all the ideas I have so far been discussing. The title of this sculpture is "And in the Track of 100,000 Years, Out of the Heart of Dust, Hope Sprang Again Like Greenness." It's from 2007. The title is from a part of a rubaiyat by Umar Khayyam, an Islamic poet from Iran who lived between 1048 and 1131. I like how in the sculpture it can be read on multiple levels, as a landscape, characters on a stage, where ruins go to die, a sculpture garden where the history of sculpture has ping-ponged itself into dust and serenity, theater in the round, actors so ancient that they become science fiction, staring off stage, waiting for Godot or the next tragedy, a palette born in a cubist world, witness to the birth of modern war machines, monuments, obelisks, temples hewed from refuse and shadows. Initially, I started this sculpture with the idea of making a platform with broken pieces of sculpture, because I was inspired by a photograph of Rodin that I'd seen in his studio. And gradually, as it started to develop, it became a landscape. And I think partly what was happening was that it was talking about how I was feeling at that time. The next couple of images are from a movie by Andrei Tarkovsky from 1979. The movie is called Stalker, and this film reflects and shares my ideas of beauty in the ruined landscape. It has an element of romanticism and optimism that I am strongly attracted to. Romantic, post-apocalyptic landscapes that I relate to, it's almost like Mondrian crashing into Turner, the fantasy of industrialism collapsing. This image is from a Karachi newspaper, Urdu newspaper, and what I find interesting is that the page on the right has articles describing actual monuments and sculptures from the Indus Valley civilization from 2400 BC and the Gandhara period, or the Gandhara civilization. And the page on the left has a headline that the war from Afghanistan has now reached Pakistan, and has a photo of a child and an older man standing next to a bombed-out ruin, and it's a bombed-out new ruin. This image is from around 16 years ago, and it still is timely. This image is from a Thomas Hirshhorn show at Barbara Gladstone Gallery several years ago. I thought it was a great show, and I was surprised at how angry it made some people. It's unfortunate that art is not seen is seen as not the place for actual political reality. It's fashionable in the art world to discuss political ideas and theories, but political reality is ignored at all costs. I don't think artists should ever feel limited or restricted by any ideology. I also love how Thomas Hirshhorn has incorporated African art, current events, modernist abstraction into this installation. It's very original and not based on fantasy. African art has been a huge influence on my work. The first time I came across it was in the early 90s when I saw it at the museum on Broadway in New York, and I'd never seen so many amazing sculptures in such a small space. And the scale, the imagery, the sophistication in dealing with the figure, it's also very tactile, and whenever I'm stuck in my work, I have a couple of books that I turn to, and the problem is always solved. This is an earlier piece, it's titled Centaur from 2000, and it was a breakthrough sculpture for me when I started to realize when I could actually stop, and sometimes you have to make a decision that you don't have to sort of continue in the way that you have in the past with other pieces. This piece obviously relates very much to the next image, which is Joseph Beuys' Chair with Fat. I'm a huge fan of his work, his connection to history, fiction, and nonfiction. I like the ritualistic quality and how his work has a fragile, transformative mythology. I also like how the work has been photographed. This is an image from his studio. It's interesting when you keep looking at artists' photographs of their studio and how so much attention has been put to them. They are not just things that, it's basically they've been done intentionally. And this photograph makes me think of Brancusi's photographs of his sculptures in the studio, which became a whole other body of work for him. This is an intense view of a Michael Heizer piece called Double Negative. Like Beuys, it has a timelessness, but is permanent and solid. This is a drawing of mine on a black and white photograph that I took from 2007. All the drawings that I do on photographs, the photographs are taken by me. That doesn't mean that I'm a really good photographer, but I'll explain later. So this is a broken Atlas figure from the Temple of Jupiter in Agrigento, Sicily. What I liked was the actual photograph, which relates to the next image, which is an ancient eroded stupa from 4000 BC from southern Pakistan. This is a drawing on ink and on a with ink and on a black and white photograph from 2007. It makes me think of a certain drone-like viewpoint. A lot of these early photo drawings used photos that I took in Karachi because my family is from there and I would visit every year. But now, since then, I've also gradually started to use photographs that I've taken in other places. This image is from a vast complex of abandoned temples in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, built between 1879 and 1218. I like the way the stone is stacked and carved. I myself use stacking as armature in my sculptures. A beautiful relief from Babylon. I'm also very interested in introducing animals into my work. This is a demon from Jeepers Creepers, the movie from several years back now. An ancient Roman stone head. This is a beautiful mask head by Matthew Monahan. Here is an example of the contemporary use of fragile materials like paper, referring to an image or mask which seems ancient and timeless. This sculpture is titled They Don't Speak from 2007. I started making busts around 2004, and I was very aware of Picasso, wanting to make large heads like he did. This is also the same time when some of the materials that I used for my armatures, like styrofoam and clay, were introduced. I also began to like how the materials complemented each other. It was a combination that I had not seen before, and realizing how modeling clay in an expressionistic way was something that I really enjoyed. And it was another turning point for me. This is another bust. It's titled JC from 2006. Most of my sculptures, pretty much all of them, have a front and a back. But if I included all those images, then I'm already going to show you a lot. So this is just the front image. This is Untitled from 2008. This image relates to an earlier image I showed of tanks in the green wastelands of Stalker, but it is of a tank in the entrance to the Baghdad Museum. I'm also interested in how here the ancient is contrasted with the frighteningly new, an endless formula of symmetry. These are examples of Saddam Hussein's fascist monuments. This is a sculpture by Sterling Ruby. I like how it relates to the next image, which is of a Bowley sculpture. And there's a lot of similarity between these two pieces, yet the materials are synthetic versus natural, but with a very similar spirit, fetishistic, ritualistic in their use. Another image from a Karachi newspaper of an I-beam being transported by a donkey cart. It's a common sight to use donkeys as a form of transport for transporting things. And donkeys are amazingly resilient and also one of my favorite animals. And this sculpture is titled The Main Player from 2007. It is an important piece for me, larger than some of the earlier heads that I showed you, because in here I refer to these as large head sculptures, but in this particular sculpture I developed the landscape idea, which was starting to make a lot of sense to me, that's why I was interested in landscape so much. And there's also a shift in scale that takes place from landscape to architecture, armature to bust. Balzac by Rodin. I happened to be looking at Rodin a lot when I started working with clay, and that was in Mexico in 2001. And I had gone there with my husband, who is an artist, and another fellow artist who was actually working with clay, and we had a lot of black bags full of clay and a Rodin book. So that's when I decided to try my hand at it, and it opened up a lot of doors for me. This is a sculpture from around that time. It's Untitled, and it's from 2004, and for me, it's romantic, referring to Balzac, and Beauty and the Beast by Jean Cocteau. This is an ancient image of a Laocoon group as the Laocoon group as monkeys. A woodcut from 1545 by Niccolo Boldini. Replacing primates with humans attracted me. This is a drawing from 2015, ink and acrylic and collage on a color photograph. It's approximately 50 by 80 inches, larger than some of the images I've shown you before up till now, and it's my Laocoon. It's very difficult to pronounce this. I also, I like using all kinds of found collage material, and around 2015, I was given a book by a friend of mine. I mean, it wasn't a book, it's High Times magazine, which I realized that the centerfolds were, could lead to some very interesting collage elements. Image of an ancient Ganesh. This piece is titled Atlas from 2015. Intertwined tire treads, solidified ghosts of travel, but reincarnated into a figure. This is approximately 16 feet long. I had been wanting to use tires for a long time because every time you're on the highway, you see blown out tire treads on the side of the road. They just look like shedded skin or bodies, and it was an interesting material, but it's very difficult to get your hands on it. So, I mean, especially when you can't stop on the highway, so, but I managed to find some. This piece is titled Sleeper from 2005. It was my first life-size standing figure. I was thinking of the chorus, and it's interesting how the pedestal in the sculpture was a found object, and it became part of the sculpture. I like the ambiguity that is it stuck in the white cube pedestal or is it part of it? My pieces, as I mentioned before, are made with the idea of each view referring to something else, so that there are more than one story within the sculpture. So you have to walk around them. This is an early chorus. An ancient Egyptian couple. I'm really drawn to the idea of walking monuments. an ancient Aztec stone sculpture of Coatlicue in Mexico City. This piece is titled Degraded from 2006. It's a Roman torso with 2x4 chorus legs, also based on The Walking Man by Rodin, and it seems sadly contemporary. As mentioned earlier, a photo of Brancusi's studio. I see here a cinematic element which I try to develop in my photos of sculpture, the first image that I showed you. This is another photographic piece. The photograph was taken in Mexico. This was the first one that I did with clay. The title is Nelly from 2003, which also shows further experiments in clay modeling and my experiments with a cinema-like setting. For me, it is also Vermeer meets Bernini's Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. Giacometti, his sculptures sometimes give the feeling that time flattens things. They look so weathered that they could be ancient. This is Rauschenberg's monogram from 1955. This piece is titled Bumps in the Road. It's from 2008. The title refers to a US soldier's term for driving over dead bodies in Iraq. I like how I developed the idea of the stage plinth road, and looking back at the larger piece I showed you earlier, which was titled In the Track of 100,000 Years, this sculpture has much more implied movement, something I get very much from looking at Rodin. It makes me think of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, traveling down Cormac McCarthy's The Road. There's a front and a back to this also. A lot of these, not a lot, a few of the larger pieces are all made up of different components that fit together or sit on top of each other. And that was an interesting problem because of having to get sculptures out of a door that's a certain size. But it actually helps you to make certain decisions which are more interesting. This is the Burghers of Calais. You can almost imagine a camera tracking around the figures in a very modern theatrical way. This piece is titled Magic Carpet. It's from 2003. The base is clear plastic, it's cheap special effects, and it's about love. Donatello's David. This is David Almage. I love the grafting here of the classical with the sci-fi. This piece is titled International Monument. It's from 2004. I started out with the idea of making a large, giant hand. I mean, it's not giant, but it feels that way. And it developed into a monument with a bone base and refers also to Tatlin's model for a monument. The bone, when I first moved to upstate New York, I had a job with a taxidermy studio. And that is where I actually learned a lot of new techniques to use in the construction of my sculptures. They also had a lot of raw material like bones, which were either chopped up, or heads, or skulls that I was able to, which they would throw away. So I had some more found objects to collect. This is an Imperial Stormtrooper reclining. It's Untitled from 2005. This piece is Untitled from 2005 also. It's the second version of this idea. First, I made it in 2002, and it originally came out, as I mentioned earlier, that when I was in Mexico, my friend was working with clay, and we had big black garbage bags with wet clay inside them. And so when I returned to my studio in New York, I also started to work with, I wanted to work with more clay, except I use air dry clay because I don't fire it. But I was still keeping it wet with the black bag. And as the sculpture developed, I began to see that it was resembling a figure and a body bag, and I just let things just flow naturally, and it became a prostrate praying figure. But it was definitely, I wanted to use the black garbage bag as a component, and I see this as a memorial. This sculpture also, like some of my other works, is a piece that can be assembled and it can travel, and all the components fit together. So this is an example of that. This is a photographic piece, but I have different hands, and obviously the setting is different. This was taken on the beach in Karachi, and it becomes more cinematic, and the narrative changes. Another sculpture that I photographed, and it exists as a photograph, and the photograph was also done in Karachi with the same idea of documenting the sculptures, but also using photography as a medium to explore the implied cinematic narrative. This is a Cindy Sherman film still, number 21 from 1979. This piece is titled Bagram from 2010. It's ink on black and white photograph. This is also a larger photograph, 50 by 80 inches. This piece is titled Museum Without Walls from 2005. I started out by making a large head inspired by Picasso's Head of a Woman at MoMA, which I saw, and as I was making it, it led to realizing the possibilities of landscape, modernism, and scale that came up. The exposed armature could be read as a modernist architectural structure or a postmodernist one, and I was also thinking of architectural machines, or machines with an architecture and skin on the outside, existing or surviving in a landscape. This is a fairly small sculpture, but the idea was to make it feel like a monument. This is Picasso, same idea of crouching figure, giant head, and recycling. This piece is titled Man of No Importance. It's from 2006. And this is the inside of the sculpture with a little figure in it. And these images highlight the scale changes that I've talked about a little bit, and I see these scale changes as metaphors for time changes, prehistory, post-history, contemporary. And I see these shifting ideas of time in the writings of Philip K. Dick, whose writings have had a huge influence on my work. And this is Philip K. Dick. This piece is Untitled from 2006. It's a white styrofoam totem with clay hands and a clay head, and they're painted with enamel. This is about, its life size also, approximately 6 feet. The title of this piece is Ethos from 2006. It's the first time that I started to carve and scratch on the styrofoam and use the carving and scratching as drawing on a sculpture. This is also approximately 6 feet. This piece is titled Born Darkly, 2008. It's carved foam and clay. This is an untitled piece. It's an early cork sculpture from 2009. I found cork in a greeting card store that was closing near where I live. They were selling off all their inventory, and I discovered the cork blocks, and that has led to a whole series of cork sculptures. So along with the clay, the cork was another element that, another material that has changed the work a lot. This piece is titled 1000. It's from 2009. It is a depiction of medieval effigies. I see this also as a sarcophagus or a tomb or a crate that has become a plinth with urban graffiti friezes, where the sculptures on top are representations of what is or was buried inside. They can also be seen as a reclining figure or a pair of architectural models for imagined tombs. This was also an opportunity to start to draw on the plinths and incorporate them in a deeper way into the sculpture. This is ink on a black and white photograph that I took. I made a whole bunch of black and white, drawings on black and white photographs for a print portfolio that I did in 2007 titled Reconstructions. The portfolio is of 16 photogravure prints and 2 woodcuts. And this is when I realized that the landscape was very essential to how I was seeing the development in the work. And so I took a lot of pictures of ongoing construction sites in Karachi and used them as plinths to draw on, which, like the first one I showed, second image that I showed you. This is Francis Bacon's Screaming Pope from 1953. The Orientalist is the title of this sculpture from 2007. It's my second bronze, and it is life-size with a silver patina. The title is from a book by Edward Said, which I was reading again at that time. It has the face of Dorian Gray as a metaphor for corrupt ideas such as Orientalism. It's also an Egyptian sphinx, or a seated god, or a cyborg king. Edward Said analyzes the history and falseness of Orientalism in an attempt to show how limiting racist historical ideologies can be. These are more drawings on black and white photographs of ongoing construction, drawing on top of construction sites. So, as I mentioned before, I was wanting to use the construction site as a plinth for imaginary gigantic sculptures that were broken up. And these were made, this was also made was part of the print series. This is another one, also from 2007. It's interesting when you move from one medium into another medium, it changes the nature of the work. But, I mean, the image is the same, but the prints look very different from the original photographs. And then I started to add color to the photographs, like the first one I showed you, but it happened around 2007, 2008. This is another example of a drawing on a color ink on black and white photograph. Also from 2008. I mentioned earlier how much I admire African sculpture and what a big influence it has been and on my work. The symmetry has been a big influence on the pastel drawings also that I began to do at this time. I used to make a lot of pastel drawings, portraits, when I was in high school, and I was pretty good at it. But when I went to college, then I stopped. When I went to art school, I stopped doing it. But then many years later, you return back to certain things that you did well. So it's always good to, go back to what you know how to do. This is Lance Henriksen. He's a character actor. I'm sure some of you have seen him. I have a lot of respect for character actors. They work hard and are very talented and true artisans of their craft. And I like seeing myself as an artisan who uses my hands. And the reason I'm showing you this is because he relates to this image. I mean, I wanted to use the symmetry of his face, which I thought related to that. And then this ink and pastel on paper from 2007. This is an image of an older work. It's Untitled from 1994. An older mixed media mask sculpture. I did a series of mask sculptures. My interest in portraiture is consistent even if the process changes. This is ink on black and white photo from 2009, and I did a series of the ink on black and white photos, and I was inspired by Picasso's, a set of lithographs that I had seen at somebody's house of Picasso's. And it was really interesting how he had taken images from the seaside and then drawn his, signature animal portraits on it, and then the rest of it was painted black. And I thought to myself, I've never seen this before, so it's my chance to steal this idea. This is an ink and pastel and collage. I started to introduce it into the pastel drawings also from 2011. This is an image of Kippenberger's, it's from Kippenberger's series of amazing lithographs inspired by Jericho's Raft of the Medusa. He did these before he died, and they're incredibly sad, but beautiful. And it was this image and this image that I was kind of thinking of. This is an image from La Ventura, the Antonioni film from 1960. The couple in the boat is going towards the island where the woman disappears. I was thinking of these kind of relationships between these two things, these two images. And they set the mood for a sculpture that I made in 2009. It's titled, My Skull is Too Small. And I see this piece as death traveling at sea, going over to the other side, but not moving, calling for help or waving goodbye. It is also a kind of memorial. A lot of my pieces deal with the idea of the sarcophagus, and the graffiti and the writing is very personal on this one. Also, this piece is very different in how it reads. it further explores some of the ideas that I was talking about when I showed the piece 1000. In this piece and in some of the pieces that you'll see coming up, you'll see a similar kind of pedestal that I'm using. These were not pedestals that I had made. I actually inherited them from another artist in the gallery who did not like them. And my gallery realized that, I will take stuff, so they offered them to me. And so these are recycled pedestals. This piece, there's also, I wanted to mention that the graffiti is also inspired. In Pakistan, there's a very different kind of graffiti, not as colorful, but as beautiful as the graffiti you see here. So I like graffiti in general, and in Pakistan, the graffiti is very political. It can be religious. It can also be vendors, showing how painters that their skill, they with their names and telephone numbers next to it, and so I was inspired by that, and plus the graffiti that I've seen here. And the messages are private, and the friezes and decorations, it feels like a boat to me. This is a piece titled Finger from 2010. I mentioned earlier that I have a collection of skulls and other bones from my previous job, and this is one of them. It's a buffalo skull, and the hand piece that I showed you was part of a buffalo skull. This piece is Untitled from 2010, and it's another large ink on photo drawing, and it has collage. I had a Jack Russell, and this is when I came, so we had a Jack Russell calendar, and I was waiting for the moment when I could start to use images of animals, dogs, all kinds of animals. So this was my first example of using the Jack Russell as part of this part of the body, the head. This piece is titled Tupac Amaru. It's from 2010, and it's also life-size. That's another view. This piece is a cork and styrofoam, or a styrofoam piece. I actually ran out of cork, so then I decided to use blue styrofoam, which I love the blue color, and it was a interesting decision on my part, which has led me to using it over and over again. And this piece is titled Student. It's from 2009, and it has a found pedestal. This is titled Ghost from 2008. This is Lecturer. It started out as a cork piece, but then it was the first cork sculpture that I made into bronze. This is another cork sculpture converted into bronze. It's titled God of Some Things. It's from 2012, and it has a patina. It's approximately 8 feet high, but from the cork is a fairly soft material, and like I mentioned before, when you go from one medium into another medium, the nature of the piece also changes, and it has a very opposite effect from the cork, and it looks and feels almost like molten lava. It's a detail of the sculpture. This piece is titled Thought and Scribe. It's from 2012. It's approximately 9 feet by 8 feet by 10 feet high. All the components are assembled together and sit on top of each other. And it is based on an Egyptian sculpture, also of Thought and Scribe. Thought is the baboon god of wisdom, and the scribe sits underneath and writes down what he says. And I wanted to use plexi again after using it only once in the sculpture that I showed you titled Magic Carpet. And so, but I wanted to wait because plexi is a material that a lot of people use, and so I wanted to come up with something interesting and where it was also the idea of, I wanted these pieces to feel like they had either landed or they were levitating, and the plexi creates that effect. It's a sci-fi kind of element for me, and Egyptians are as aliens is also a common sci-fi theme. It's an homage to Chamberlain, except my scribe is a crushed, reclining figure. The next few images are from my show at PS1, installation shots of the show. And this is the entrance where a god and a ghost, well, I'm calling the sculpture on the left is God of Somethings from 2012, and the bronze sculpture on the right is Ghost of Human Kindness from 2011. And the one on the right is a painted bronze, the one on the left is a patina bronze. They are approximately, I think the one on the right is a little bit higher. It's 8.5 feet approximately. And it's the second sculpture where I've used styrofoam and clay. I'm playing here with the illusion that can be created by bronze. It looks light, but it's actually almost 1 ton. It's not a new idea, but I tried to add an element of casual but expressive construction to this. This is another view which I liked. So the god and the ghost greet you on the outside. Then the show was titled Unnatural Histories. And this sculpture the show's title comes from this sculpture, which is again another one of my large multi-component pieces. I was inspired by how landscape can look like skin. And so the back of the sculpture is the first time I also used a tire tread. And so the skin of the landscape almost looks like shedding snake skin at some times. And then it also has a very strong front and then a back, and there are 5 components altogether that fit, and it has this found cardboard cutout that I found behind, I think it was Chase Bank, and I picked it up and kept it in my studio for a while till the right moment occurred where because with this one you can see the face of the guy through this. I add a lot of little details to these sculptures which you have to sort of look inside them, because the armatures can be really beautiful and are the bone structure of the sculpture. And then when I leave them exposed, it gives me various little areas where I can insert objects or drawings or sometimes invitations from art shows, making them look, just various different. So the idea is that, you have to just keep looking for different information. This is another view of one of the rooms with the standing figures. This piece in the front is titled Chain of Missing Links. It's from 2012. In these images, you can get a sense of the height of some of these pieces. This is another image of an installation. This piece is titled There is No Killing What Can't Be Killed. It's from 2012. It was my largest cork sculpture mixed with styrofoam at that time. This is the front. It's great. This is the largest screen I've ever shown my work at, so it's exciting to see everything so clear and big. There were different, obviously I have become better at carving, so this is an example of that. This is another drawing on a photograph with collage. It's from 2013. And another drawing on a photograph from 2016. This piece is titled Vessel from 2014. This is Ink, Pastel and Collage with Wolves from 2014. It's another ink, pastel, and collage. These are all untitled. This is another drawing on a large photograph. The other two ones, the photo drawings that I showed you, are also 50 by 80 inches. And another one. This is from 2014. No, this is for 15, sorry. This is a bronze sculpture. It's titled Constantium from 2014. What was interesting here was that the plinth that the sculpture is on, which is also bronze, was a found object given to me by somebody. People gave me styrofoam also as presents. And so this piece was some kind of door, and the chain was part of that piece, that wooden structure. I was using it mainly because when I was carving the cork, I used it as something to put the sculpture on top instead of it being on the floor. And I continued to work on the sculpture. It kind of finished, and then the chain was lying around. And actually, it was midway that I realized that the chain is something that I would like to incorporate with the sculpture to make it part of it. And so it works as a necklace, and it's one of those kind of knotted necklaces that I'd seen some people wear. And but I just saw that it would add something very different to the piece. And when they made it in the foundry, the chain is also bronze. They found it's some kind of postal chain. And the patina on the base it was an old piece of wood that was kind of red and rusted and everything, but they made it look exactly like that. This piece is also bronze. It's approximately 8 feet, and the title of this piece is Friend. It's from 2015. This piece, and along with the other styrofoam piece that I showed you in my PS1 show, the recreation of the styrofoam is so beautiful and so detailed that it literally feels like you can walk up to it and push it. It really feels light. At the same time, around 2015, I also started to make some drawings that were happening in a very organic way, and they were almost like rubbings, because I had placed some of this white paper and this other construction paper on the floor. I was working on cork sculptures at the same time, so the dust was moving all over the place, and they started to emerge slowly, and then I started to notice what was happening on the floor, and then I started putting them on the wall to see how I could add to them. And they're made out of a lot of cork dust and some drawing and spray painting, and they started to look to me like rheograms, tracking the forest of my sculptures, and they're about studio traffic, covered with the dust of footprints, paint residue, and a rubbing that appears also like a map where sculptures were housed. Ghosts of the studio process made me think of Man Ray. And so this is another one. This one is 16 feet tall, and this is about 10, I think. This piece is another large cork and styrofoam sculpture from 2014, and it's titled Against What, Against Whom? This one has multiple heads, not just front and back head, but 4 heads. I draw a lot. I draw on the sculptures with oil stick and spray paint and lipstick, nail polish, different things. This piece is titled Special Guest Star. It's from 2016, and it's a new theatrical twist in my work, breaking away from the usual either vertical or horizontal orientation of the figurative sculpture. Here I am tilting the plinth. Unfortunately, I should have another image from the side, but I'm tilting the plinth figure at a 45-degree angle by placing a simple welded metal stand on the, I guess you can imagine it, on one end underneath it. The resulting angle creates a dynamism and a drama that activates the reclining figure, a figure which puts Jasper Johns in an erotic encounter with my own version of post-Louise Bourgeois figurative sculpture in an exciting and new way. This new sculpture highlights my long-term interest in revisiting the history of figurative sculpture through the time machine of contemporary cinematic science fiction and horror. It is also very democratic, as there are a lot of ideas in this piece, but no one idea is the dominating one. And that is my final image. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I'm interested in most of the references that you've shown where if like white, male, European mostly, and North American artists. I'm wondering what are your influence outside of this kind of ruins from hundreds or thousands of years ago and kind of contemporary European and Western artists, like other female artists from Pakistan, or outside of the canon that we kind of study here particularly? And also, is there a critique or an actual reverence to this appropriation that happened when modernism took over some of this quote-unquote primitive and West and Central African sculptures as a way of, also without knowing their use or the rituals or whatever, just like taking them? And I'm wondering, where is the critique, or is it a reverence that you have for this technique?
I'm not interested in critique, only reverence. I mean, that's not my work does not involve that kind of critique. I like to, look at whatever I find interesting or whatever attracts me, and then to figure out how I can combine the various different interests that I have to make something that I think is intense, beautiful, sort of, that's what I mean. It's something that looks really good.
Hello.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your PS1 show. It was a favorite, so I'm really glad that you're here.
Thank you.
You mentioned a lot of your references being either from the ancient past or from sci-fi in the future. And I'm wondering if there are any specific historical moments between those two eras that have had an impact on your work or your imagination, or...
Like, for example, what time are you talking about?
Anything. I mean, it could be anywhere. If there's something in particular, maybe not, but I'm curious.
Well, I mean, I combined a whole bunch of images so that it could... I relate to things visually, so that's why the images relate with my work visually, too. So I guess, I chose the ones that I wanted to include.
Okay.
I mean, of course, there's a lot of stuff that you can put in. But I think, I guess I chose the ones that are closest to, like what I find where major changes happen within the history of sculpture also.
Okay.
So I think there are no, I mean, there might be other moments, but I'll have to
like
think
outside of
about
the art world specifically is what,
Sorry?
like, I mean, sort of like outside of the art world, outside of sculpture, or like,
Well,
because I just, with the unknown history, or the unnatural histories, and I just couldn't help when I saw there was something so uncanny about it, like they were survivors of some kind of some event, and then, I don't know.
I guess the event would be war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we seem to be living in an endless time of war. It's like endless war.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that is something, that one could, maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, maybe. Great, thank you.
Thank you for such a great bunch of images. It's wonderful to see all your work
Thank you.
together like that. So I wanted to just see if you could follow up on the last comment you made about this being kind of a democratically thought of sculpture where not one idea takes precedence over another one. Is that something that kind of flows through a lot of the work? It seems like that.
Well, in this piece, because there are, I saw a combination of different ideas, and it's not a totemic piece like some of the other ones I've shown you, and it's a mixed media piece. So I don't know if you can clearly see there's a paintbrush there, and then, the idea of erotic, there's eroticism there, which is more apparent in this. Then the head and the horns become like arms or a head, And so for me, those are different ideas within the making of the work. And that's why I said that, so that it's not, the head is not any more important than the feet in the slippers, or the separation between the legs, or, it's just kind of, they flow with equal importance.
First of all, thank you for taking time to talk to us tonight. It was a really interesting lecture. Many artists who have lived through a sort of migration are perceived differently in the different contexts they have experienced. Do you feel as if you have to live a sort of duality in different contexts, or do you stand your ground as like a single individual despite the context you're in during your experience of migration?
Yeah, I just, live the way I want to live. I try to stay out of situations where, there has to be some kind of duality that I don't want to, I don't do that. No.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'd like to ask you, from the perspective of someone who's taking classes, I remembered that you said no one should ever fear to put their work or have their work deal with a legitimate political reality as opposed to like a fashionable reality. How do you recommend sidestepping a lot of like the contention that comes with making like politically realistic works in an academic setting or just a discussion setting? Like, do you think it's the artist's job to at sometimes facilitate that conversation?
I guess it depends on the kind of work you do, I mean, I don't see my work as political. I'm not a political artist. I'm more of an expressionistic artist. I mean, my work is expressionistic. It's much more emotional. I think, I try to find ways of letting what is non-art seep into my work in a way where it is not, because I'm not talking about a specific event or a specific date, but so I have to sort of, it comes through in a much more emotive way, how I feel, and sometimes giving, you have to sort of, I don't want to be literal in that way. I mean, I'm more interested in making sculpture and just making art, and but obviously I'm aware of what's happening around me and outside, and in the world, so you cannot ignore a lot of things, but I try to find a way to for that to seep into the work without the literalness, I hope that answers your... And that is usually by solving problems within the sculpture and trying to give or introducing certain... I think that's why one looks back, or I look back at the history of sculpture and, how, because a lot of the sculpture I showed you was, made with, either it was commissioned or it was made, but they had to encompass a lot of ideas and of the time into it, so it's all within one piece, So.
Just a quick follow-up. Early on, you discussed making your own photographs versus appropriating other photography, and you hinted that there was a reason that you would get to. So I'm curious.
No, I said that, what I said was that, I'm not interested in appropriating images, and I don't want to take images from the internet, and so when you take your own photographs, there's a quirkiness and a weirdness to them, to your choices, which is a little bit unusual from what Google gives you or whatever, so that's why I prefer to take my own photographs. I'm not a photographer as such, so the color, I think that's what I meant, was that the color is not perfect, but as long as it's in focus, so that's it, so, and then, because what I do is I take a bunch of photographs with film, and I have, 4x5s made, and then I pick out what I like, so they could be details of sculptures, they could be details of landscape, or bigger landscape, or, it could be dogs, or anything, and then as I'm going through them, trying to figure out which ones should be enlarged or made bigger, then I just make that decision. So, but I think that that adds to the sort of oddness of the image. I mean, it's not familiar.
Thank you.
Actually, that's the word, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, there's a question.
How's it going? Where in Mexico did you live? And
Sorry, I can't hear you.
excuse me. Where in Mexico did you live, and what did you take?
Can you
with
repeat that again?
What part of Mexico did you live in?
In Guadalajara.
Wow. And
I was going there with my husband. He was having something made there, and we did. I was there 2 or 3 times because I wanted to just visit Mexico, and then it so happened that there's so much to see there, and then of course I was introduced to clay, which was very important for me.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.